Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to this edition of African Perspective. I know it's been a long time coming. I know a lot of you have been waiting for this, but thank you for being patient. So, what we want to do is reflect on the decade past, look at some of the most memorable moments from the past decade, from the 2010 FIFA World Cup to the Arab Spring to the fall of strongmen, African leaders such as Robert Mugabe and al-Bashir. We'll be reflecting on all of that and also trying to look at what can we expect in the next decade of 2020. So let's get started. So before I get straight into some of the events and the things that happened in the 10 years from 2010, I just want to give a bit of context about what the general sentiment was around Africa going into the new decade. And I remember there was just so much optimism around Africa, the whole narrative of Africa rising. You know, over the years or in previous decades, the narrative of Africa had been, one about civil war, strife, disease. It started to change a little bit. And, this was due to, having more African voices getting, worldwide acclaim, such as, Chimamanda Adichie, who would talk about, the danger of a single story. People like Paul Kagame, Liberia's Ellen Johnson Sirleaf were lauded as the new face of African leadership. You also had, even on the economic front, despite a global economic recession in 2008, Africa still showed positive signs of growth compared to other regions of the world. So really, it was a really optimistic time, and people are saying that it's Africa's time to rise up. Another element that we cannot forget as well is the advent of social media. This was the social media in its infancy, and we started to see only its effects on society slowly at that time. I think at the time, the idea around social media, or the sentiment around social media, was that it was a tool to connect the world, to connect Africa. It will be a tool for political mobilization, to be a tool for good, really. And we'll see how all that changed over the past decade. So let's reflect on some of the things that happened. So the first memorable moment from the past decade for me has to be the 2010 FIFA World Cup in South Africa, the first ever World Cup or showpiece event of this magnitude held on the African continent. I still remember it like it was the other day. The first goal by Sifire Shabalala against Mexico for South Africa to open the World Cup proceedings was so memorable. I also remember Ghana. Ghana was on the brink of being the first country from the African continent to make it to the semi-finals of the World Cup, and I don't think anyone would have bet against them winning. But if it wasn't for the Suarez handball, I think we'd have been having a different story now. But it was just a wonderful event. I remember the fanfare around it, the excitement around it, not only in South Africa, but I think across the continent, the pride that you had in hosting such a massive event. South African government invested massive resources into the hosting of this event, from infrastructure to the improvement of social amenities, to the improvement of stadia. And I think a lot of observers at the time believed that the 2010 World Cup would be the springboard for South Africa to take its economy to the next level. But since then, it's been a tumultuous time, actually. It's been a tumultuous decade politically and economically for South Africa, from the Marikana mine, shootings to Zuma's, resignation, there's been just a lot of political and economic flux in South Africa. And it was also a similar dynamic also, weirdly enough, with Brazil. After the 2014 World Cup, everyone thought as well it would be an economic and political springboard. I think that puts into question the validity of holding such showpiece events and investing so much, and whether or not this actually benefits the people, whether it's just kind of a commercial event. So I think those are some things that you have to consider. It's been a tough period for South Africa generally, but I do hope they'll bounce back in this new decade. I think it started so well. I mean, it ended well rather, with the Springboks winning the World Cup last year, as well as Miss Universe. But let's wait and see. Let's see what happens in the next decade in South Africa. So the next event that we have to reflect on is the Arab Spring in 2011, in the end of 2011, and it's incredible to think how the suicide or the self-immolation of one man by the name of Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia sparked off an uprising that swept across North Africa through to the whole of the Arab world. I think the Arab Spring essentially will probably be amongst the top two or three most powerful moments or events of the 21st century. And I know for sure, for me, in my view, this was the biggest event of the decade. I remember at the time it was just incredible, incredible pictures and scenes of people standing and protesting, millions of people protesting across different cities in the Arab world. You know, the symbolic Tahrir Square in Egypt, in Cairo, was filled with, thousands and throngs of people. And in other public spaces across the Arab world and North Africa, it was the same case. And we saw the fall of two strongman leaders or long-standing leaders, Hosni Mubarak and, of course, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. One really powerful feature of this Arab Spring or this revolution of uprising was the use of social media. I think it was the first time that we really saw the use of social media in political mobilization and mass political mobilization. I think this was also a time where we saw social media used to highlight some of the atrocities that some of the governments were doing during the crackdown of those protests. And this just kind of added, more fuel to the fire. And this is when I think a lot of governments, not only in Africa, but across the world, started to look at social media as a powerful weapon that they have to kind of limit in terms of uprisings and revolutions. So it was a really interesting dynamic to see. So despite the initial fanfare and happiness about, in Libya, for example, Muammar Gaddafi was deposed. In Egypt, Hosni Mubarak was deposed. Ever since then, and as we come to the end of the decade and now enter a new decade, there's kind of, I think people in those countries are somewhat disappointed by, the aftermath of the revolution, because they thought, once you remove the individual, all the problems will go. But essentially, these are institutions that they've entrenched over the years that were designed to keep them in power. So, of course, changing the whole dynamic of how the government system runs will take a long time. And as history has gone to show, after every revolution, there's always a tumultuous period of transition. So I think it's something that people have to note. Nonetheless, the Arab Spring is probably the most seismic event of the decade and probably even of the century. And we are still seeing the effects of it. Syria, for example, is still at war. Yemen is still at war as a result of, the Arab Spring or the uprising. And I think what we can only do is now observe what will happen in the next decade and see how things develop. But I think we still need time to reflect and kind of reconcile the effects of this revolution, because I think the 2010s as well will be a time that will be remembered, a decade that will be remembered for a whole myriad of, long-standing leaders that were deposed or had to step down from power. Of course, we've already mentioned Egypt's Hosni Mubarak and Muammar Gaddafi during the Arab Spring. But throughout the decade, surprisingly, in very surprising circumstances and very varying circumstances, we have seen a whole myriad of long-standing leaders that have stepped down, namely President Robert Mugabe, the liberation leader. He had been the president of Zimbabwe for the whole period of its existence since independence, and he had to step down through a military coup, or he was ousted really. You had Omar al-Bashir after a whole series of protests in Sudan that had to step down after close to 30 years, or over 30 years, I can't remember the number. You had Joseph Kabila, who stepped down and gave way to a democratic process rather. We had João dos Santos of Angola. We had Abdelaziz Bouteflika from Algeria, who stepped down also after a series of protests. It's been an incredible time, essentially, for revolution. So we're talking close to 10 leaders that had to step down over the past decade. You know, not just leaders who had ruled for a long, long time with an iron fist. Could we start talking about a trend? And could we see more of that in the next decade? I don't believe so, and this is why. I think each the context was different for each, deposition really. I think a moment that will forever be etched in people's minds, or a symbol actually, of all of these leaders kind of tumbling down and the revolutions around them, or be it the resignation or ousting by democratic election. I think one that will stay in my mind always will be the young lady in Sudan who was leading a group of protesters in Sudan's capital, in Khartoum. And she was just emblematic. The symbol of her just mobilizing people and getting them together was just, I think, an incredible image, and showing the role that young people had, and even women had, in these in the revolution in Sudan. It will be interesting to observe how these countries cope with the new governments in transition, as they look to move on from the stranglehold of the legacy of these leaders. And already we've seen some rocky starts. For example, in Zimbabwe, we have Mnangagwa, who's the current president. Mnangagwa, who's very much part of Mugabe's inner circle takeover. So it's pretty much same old. It's going to be a difficult and tumultuous transition, but we do hope for the best, and we do hope for more democratic and inclusive institutions at the end of the day, and to have more accountabilities for the leaders. Another highlight that we have to reflect on from the decade was the hashtag and bring back our girls. This was as a result of the girls that were abducted in northern Nigeria by the group Boko Haram. And this was in Chibok in the year 2014. And unfortunately, this was not the first abduction of children by Boko Haram. Boko Haram has been infamous for targeting educational centers, schools, institutions, and recruiting and abducting children for their activities. But I think this one got worldwide acclaim because it targeted specifically girls, and also just the sheer number in one go, over 200 girls that were abducted in a single day. And a lot of celebrities and public figures from around the world, from Michelle Obama to P. Diddy to, I mean, you name it, a whole myriad of personalities came around the hashtag, and it was a wonderful thing in that respect, to be able to shine the light on what was a terrible event. Nonetheless, it kind of, there was no nuance, or there was no, complexity in terms of the way this whole event was explained, and the experience of the thousands of other children that have been abducted by Boko Haram isn't really well captured by this single hashtag. But it was definitely one highlight that we have to remember, and also just showed the power of social media in creating advocacy and creating kind of a lot of buzz around a certain issue. But I think that's not the way you should approach it. And even when you talk about the Nigerian government response to it, unfortunately, it was only after pressure from international organizations, international bodies, and advocacy groups that they started to really look at it and say, oh, wow, this is a terrible problem. In fact, till today, the Nigerian government has been criticized a lot for the way they have dealt with the whole issue of Boko Haram and terrorism in northern Nigeria and Nigeria as a whole, but also just the way they've not been able to really fully deal with the abduction of children in the region. And I think till today we still We still have over 100 of the girls who have still not been found. Some of them have been rescued, but some of them are still not found. So it's a terrible, terrible, thing that happened to them. And, we do hope that, the rest of them will be rescued eventually, but it just sheds light of how, yes, a hashtag could help in creating awareness, but there is a limit to how much it can actually influence what is happening on the ground. And in this decade, we also saw the birth of the youngest country in the world, South Sudan. After years of civil war and conflict and strife, South Sudan finally gained its independence in 2011. And there was a lot of fanfare around this. I remember seeing pictures of the official day, or the official hoisting of the flag, and it was incredible to see. But despite the initial, happiness and euphoria, this kind of turned a bit sour when, the realizations of, or the challenges of building a new nation and creating unity and forging unity came under a lot of strife when the president, Salva Kiir, and former vice president actually, Riek Machar, now the main opposition leader, went head to head in terms of a superiority or supremacy battle. In terms of, they both claimed that they would be the best leaders for the transition, and they didn't see eye to eye essentially in terms of, their visions of how to run the country. Of course, there was always going to be potential conflict between the vice president and the president, who both believe that, they're capable leaders. A civil war broke out in 2013, and a lot of people started to really question whether or not this project, this nation building project, would really work. But over the past year, there have been a series of talks, and last year in Rome, they had a summit where they kind of agreed on a framework for a peace deal. And it was kind of a weird event because the Pope was kissing the feet of some of the dignitaries. It was just, I don't know. I mean, the optics of that was just weird, but otherwise, I think they're working towards a peace deal, which is good news. But it just goes to show how difficult it is to build a new nation. But we wish the people of South Sudan all the best. South Sudan has so many talented people, especially coming from diaspora, and I know they're really eager to rebuild the country, and I hope that they can be able to do it. So we move on to Kenya, where in 2017, for the first time in the history of not only Kenya but in African history, a court, the Supreme Court of Kenya, annulled the election result. Usually, with elections on the continent, we are accustomed to hearing courts uphold, elections that were rigged, or, elections that were not valid. But somehow, this was a wonderful development in my view, where we had the court stand up as an independent institution to check and really hold the powers that be accountable to a free and fair election. Unfortunately, the election was a sham from the start. The director of the Electoral Commission, and he was the head of IT, he was called Chris Msando, God rest his soul, who was killed a week just before the election. We have a lot of electoral observers from, places like the EU and other Western foreign observers from the UN, who gave it a clean bill of health. They said this was a good election. And it's ridiculous because I think the standard for African elections, or the expectation for African elections, was so low that they said, relatively speaking, this was a decent election. So that was kind of the irony. And it was only after, I remember listening to the radio, BBC Radio, one of the election observers said that even with the keenest eyes, it was impossible to see some of the irregularities. Despite all the events after the election, and the different political dynamics that are currently taking place in Kenya, between Raila Odinga, between the current vice president and the president Uhuru Kenyatta. I think the silver lining in this story was the courts and their independence and their ability to stand up to governments and really act as a real check and balance for the government and really hold people accountable. So I think that was the silver lining. But of course, the dynamics in Kenya are still very difficult, a very difficult political situation that we found ourselves in, also economic situation. But I think there's still that silver lining that you can still hold on to. I think another highlight that is also worth noting is the ascension of Abiy Ahmed as Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and this saw the detente between Ethiopia and Eritrea, a discord between the two countries that essentially that has been running for a whole number of decades. Finally, one man with sweeping reforms and with some, youthful energy just comes and kind of, changes the whole dynamic between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and also within Ethiopia itself. Abiy Ahmed has been running a series of reforms, which has been incredible to see. It will be interesting to see how it will go even into the next decade. I think he's come under a lot of pressure, especially in his first year, but I think when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, that gave him a bit of respite. And he won it deservedly, but I think he still has a lot of challenge of the ethnic divisions, or, the ethnic, federalism model that essentially that has existed for so many years. So kind of reforming these institutions will take a long time, and I do wish him all the best. So what do I think will happen in the next decade? What is the general sentiment going to the next decade? I believe there's more nuance in the whole story of Africa rising. It's not just, positivity, and, there's a bit more nuance, and also kind of understanding and deconstructing the reasons as to why, this Africa rising narrative emerged in the first place. Who is it for? Is it for, commercial interest in Africa to make it look more attractive? Or is it actually things that are changing on the ground? Another dynamic that we have to watch out for as well, in the coming decade, is the growing youth population and youth unemployment in Africa, which will be a serious issue and a serious challenge, especially as a lot of youth move into urban areas. How will governments deal with this policy issue? Another dynamic I think we'll also have to look at is the role of data in society, and especially the role of social media platforms. I think governments are only now getting to grips with how powerful these platforms are, and now you've had governments around Africa shut down the internet completely. So how will data start to influence political conversations and political spaces? So that's something interesting that we have to watch out for. We also have to really look out for is climate change, and I think now climate change and its effects are starting to manifest, and they'll manifest themselves more in the coming decade. Last year we saw the cyclone Idai that hit Zimbabwe, Malawi, I think parts of Madagascar as well, a hurricane that was deadly. And we've been seeing some peculiar weather patterns across East Africa and other parts of Africa. People complaining that there's been too much rain, or there have been periods of drought. Just peculiar weather patterns. And I think we're starting to see the manifest of global warming on the African continent. So that's something to watch for the next decade. Another thing that I'd also, want to observe is the emergence of young African leaders such as Bobby Wine, such as Abiy Ahmed. How will they fare? Bobby Wine wants to stand in the 2021 election in Uganda against the long standing Yoweri Museveni. Will we see other long-term autocratic leaders step down from power? That's also another question I'd want to see. So it's going to be very interesting. So I'm hoping everyone has a positive start to the year. I wish you a lovely year. Wish you all the best. Wish you a happy new decade as well. Thank you for tuning in.